Dorothy Brown had lived in Oakfield Village for 50 years. Her small cottage with the blue door was known to everyone. At 74, with silver hair and kind eyes, she spent her days tending her garden and helping at the community center. Dorothy had taught most of the town's children over her 40 years as a teacher. The trouble began when a group of young men moved into the abandoned house across the street. They were loud and rude. At first, Dorothy tried to be friendly, waving, when she collected her post, but they began to shout nasty words at her because of her skin color. "Just ignore them," her friend Mary said when Dorothy rang her. "They'll get bored and move on." But Dorothy had lived through too much in her life to believe that hatred would simply go away if ignored. Each morning, she found herself dreading to step outside her own front door. Dorothy remembered her younger days when she had stood tall against such treatment. Back then, she had marched alongside others fighting for equal rights. She had taught children of all backgrounds to respect each other. Now in her golden years, she faced the same ugly hatred she thought was behind her. The young men would sit on their porch all day, drinking and playing loud music. Whenever Dorothy stepped outside, they would call her terrible names. They laughed when they saw her hands shake as she tried to tend her beloved rose garden. One Tuesday morning, Dorothy woke early to water her flowers before the summer heat set in. As she carefully moved between the rows of roses, her grandmother had first planted decades ago, she heard the door across the street slam open. "Look who's up early," shouted one of the young men. He was tall with blonde hair and always seemed to be the leader. "Better get inside, old woman. This isn't your street anymore." Dorothy's heart raced, but she stood straight and continued watering her flowers. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her afraid, but inside fear was growing. What if their words turned into actions? What if they did more than just shout? That evening, Dorothy sat in her living room looking at old photographs. One showed her standing proudly beside a young boy named Thomas Williams on prize-giving day. He had been one of her favorite students, bright and kind, even when others weren't. The newspaper clipping beside the photo showed that same boy, now a successful lawyer who fought for people's rights. Dorothy's fingers traced over the telephone number she had written down years ago when Thomas had sent her a Christmas card. "Keep in touch, Mrs. Brown," he had written. "I'll never forget what you taught me." She hadn't called him in years. Would he even remember her? Would he care about an old woman's troubles? Dorothy put down the photo and sighed. Perhaps Mary was right. Perhaps she should just ignore the young men and hope they would eventually leave. As Dorothy prepared for bed that night, she heard a crash outside. Looking through her bedroom window, she saw her mailbox knocked over and the young men running back across the street laughing. Something changed in Dorothy at that moment. A lifetime of standing up for what was right came rushing back to her. She had not fought all her life to be bullied in her own home during her final years. With trembling fingers, Dorothy picked up her phone and found Thomas's number. It was late, but this couldn't wait until morning. As the phone rang, Dorothy wondered if this call would make any difference at all. But she had to try. She had to do something. When a sleepy voice answered, Dorothy almost lost her nerve. "Hello?" she said quietly. "Is this Thomas Williams? It's Mrs. Brown, your old teacher from Oakfield Village. I'm sorry to call so late, but I need your help." Thomas answered the phone despite the late hour. His voice was warm and familiar, even after all these years. "Mrs. Brown, what's wrong?" he asked, instantly alert when he heard the worry in her voice. Dorothy explained everything. The young men across the street, their cruel words, the knocked-over mailbox, and how the police hadn't helped. Thomas listened quietly until she finished. "Those boys picked the wrong teacher to mess with," he said firmly. "I'll be there tomorrow morning. Try to get some sleep, Mrs. Brown." Dorothy didn't fully believe anything would change, but hearing Thomas's confident voice made her feel less alone. She slept better that night than she had in weeks. The next morning, Dorothy was making tea when she heard loud knocking at her door. Her heart jumped with fear. Were the young men now coming to her house? She peeked through the curtains and saw a tall, well-dressed man on her doorstep. It took her a moment to recognize him. Thomas Williams, now with touches of gray in his hair but with the same kind smile. "Mrs. Brown," he said, hugging her gently when she opened the door. "I came as soon as I could." Thomas sat at her kitchen table while Dorothy made fresh tea. He asked detailed questions about the harassment, writing everything down in a small notebook. "Why are you helping me?" Dorothy asked. "You must be very busy with important cases." Thomas looked at her seriously. "Do you remember when I was 10 and the other boys wouldn't let me join their football games?" he asked. "You told me that standing up for what's right is always important, no matter how small it seems." Dorothy nodded, the memory coming back, slowly. "You changed my life," Thomas continued. "I became a lawyer because of you, because you taught me that everyone deserves fairness and respect." Just then, they heard loud music start up across the street. Thomas walked to the window and watched the young men lounging on their porch. "I see," he said quietly. "I think it's time for a chat." Dorothy grabbed his arm. "Please don't. They might hurt you." Thomas smiled. "Trust me, Mrs. Brown. I deal with tougher people every day in court." He handed her his business card. It read, "Thomas Williams, Queen's Counsel, Human Rights Law." Dorothy watched nervously from her window as Thomas crossed the street. The young men stood up when they saw him, approaching. The blonde leader stepped forward with a threatening look. Though Dorothy couldn't hear the conversation, she could see Thomas speaking calmly, showing the men something on his phone. Their faces changed from angry to worried as Thomas continued, talking. After about 10 minutes, the young men went inside their house and Thomas walked back across the street. "What did you say to them?" Dorothy asked when he returned. "I simply explained who you are," Thomas replied, "and I showed them some news articles about similar harassment cases where I represented the victims. I mentioned the police chief is an old friend of mine." Dorothy didn't fully understand, but for the rest of the day, the house across the street remained quiet. No music, no shouting. "They might be quiet today because you're here," Dorothy said as evening approached. "But what about tomorrow?" Thomas smiled. "I've taken care of that too," he said. "Check your phone." Dorothy's phone had been buzzing all afternoon with messages from former students who had heard about her situation. Emma, now a doctor at the local hospital, Robert, who owned the grocery store, and dozens more, all planning to visit over the coming days. "You taught us all to look after each other," Thomas said. "Now it's our turn to look after you." That night, for the first time in weeks, Dorothy sat on her front porch without fear, watching the sunset as Thomas made calls on his phone nearby. The house across the street remained silent. The next morning, Dorothy woke to find a police car parked outside her house. Officer James, the same young man who had taken her report earlier, was talking to Thomas on her front steps. "Mrs. Brown," Officer James said when she opened the door, looking embarrassed. "I've come to apologize. I should have done more when you first reported the harassment. Mr. Williams here has explained everything." Dorothy invited them both inside for tea. Officer James took new notes about everything that had happened, this time writing down every detail carefully. "The chief inspector will be visiting personally this afternoon," Officer James explained. "He wants to meet you and see the situation for himself." After the policeman left, Dorothy noticed something strange. The young men across the street were packing things into a van. The blonde leader looked over, saw her watching, and quickly turned away. "What's happening?" Dorothy asked Thomas. "It seems they've decided to move on," Thomas said with a small smile. "I may have mentioned that the house owner could be sued for allowing his property to be used for harassment. He called them this morning and told them to leave." Dorothy could hardly believe it. "Will they really go?" "They will," Thomas assured her. "And there's more good news. I've been making calls." Throughout the day, Dorothy's phone kept ringing. Former students were calling to check on her. Some even drove to her house bringing food, flowers, and offers of help. Emma, now a doctor at the local hospital, brought her young daughter. "This is Mrs. Brown," Emma told the little girl. "She taught me to read when everyone else gave up on me." Robert from the grocery store arrived with bags of food. "I'll deliver your shopping every week from now on, Mrs. Brown," he promised. "No need for you to carry heavy bags anymore." By afternoon, so many people had gathered that it looked like a small party on Dorothy's lawn. When the chief inspector's car pulled up, he looked surprised at the crowd. "Mrs. Brown," he said, shaking her hand, "I had no idea you were so well known in our community." "She taught half the town," someone called out. "Including your daughter, sir." The chief inspector smiled. "That's true. My Jessica still talks about your classroom." He became serious again. "I promise you, this situation will be properly addressed. We're increasing patrols in this area, and I've personally spoken to the property owner across the street." As the day went on, Dorothy watched in amazement as her small garden filled with people who cared about her. The young men finished loading their van and drove away without looking back. No one cheered or made a fuss. They simply watched silently as the van disappeared down the road. "What happens to the house now?" Dorothy asked Thomas as they sat on her porch that evening after most people had gone home. "That's another surprise," Thomas said. "Several of your former students have pooled their money to buy it. They're thinking of turning it into a small community center for children. They want to name it after you." Dorothy's eyes filled with tears. "I don't understand. Why would they do all this for me?" "Because you did so much for them," Thomas explained simply. "You didn't just teach reading and writing. You taught kindness and courage." That night, Dorothy slept peacefully for the first time in weeks. The house across the street was dark and quiet. Her phone was next to her bed, filled with messages from people who cared. One call had changed everything, not because Thomas had special powers, but because that one call had reminded an entire community about the connections between them. Connections that Dorothy had helped build over 50 years of teaching. The days that followed were busy ones for Dorothy. The house across the street was empty now, but rarely quiet. Workers came and went, fixing the broken porch steps, painting the peeling walls, and planting flowers in the overgrown garden. Thomas visited every few days to check on the progress and to have tea with Dorothy. "The community center should be ready to open in about a month," he told her one afternoon as they watched a new sign being hung above the front door. It read, "The Dorothy Brown Learning Center." Dorothy shook her head in wonder. "I still can't believe all this is happening because of one phone call." "Not because of one phone call," Thomas corrected her gently. "Because of 50 years of kindness." The phone call just reminded everyone of what they already knew. The local newspaper sent a reporter to interview Dorothy about her teaching career and the new center. The story appeared on the front page with a large photograph of Dorothy standing in front of her roses. The headline read, "Local Hero Teacher Gets Fitting Tribute." Soon, letters began arriving from all over the country. Former students who had moved away wrote to share memories of Dorothy's classroom and to thank her for the difference she had made in their lives. One letter came from a man named William, who now lived in London. "You may not remember me," he wrote, "but I was the shy boy who couldn't read in your class 30 years ago. You stayed after school with me every day for a year. Now I'm an English professor. Every student I help is because you helped me first." As the opening day for the center approached, Dorothy found herself busier than she had been in years. The committee running the center asked if she would help design some of the reading programs. Young teachers from the local school came to ask her advice about working with children who struggled to learn. "I thought I was finished being useful," Dorothy told Mary over tea. "I thought those days were behind me." "Nonsense," Mary replied. "You were never just a teacher in a classroom. You taught this whole town how to be better people." The night before the center was due to open, Dorothy couldn't sleep. She sat in her living room looking through old photo albums by lamplight. So many faces smiled back at her, children she had taught, colleagues she had worked with, friends she had made along the way. There was a soft knock at her door. Dorothy was surprised to find Emma standing there, still in her doctor's coat from the hospital. "I'm sorry it's so late," Emma said, "but I wanted to give you this before tomorrow's big event." She handed Dorothy a small package wrapped in blue paper. Inside was a silver bell, just like the one Dorothy had used to start class each morning. We thought you should be the one to ring the first bell at the center tomorrow, Emma explained. Dorothy held the bell carefully, feeling its weight in her hands. I'm nervous, she admitted. What if I'm too old now to help these children, Emma? Took Dorothy's hands in hers. You were never just teaching us reading and writing, she said. You taught us to believe in ourselves. Now it's time for you to believe in yourself too. The next morning, Dorothy stood on the steps of the newly renovated house across the street. A crowd had gathered, former students, neighbors, local officials, and many children who would soon be using the center. The mayor stepped forward to cut the ribbon, but first he turned to Dorothy. None of us would be here today without Mrs. Brown, he said to the crowd. She taught us in her classroom and now she's taught us again. That one person speaking up for what's right can change an entire community. Dorothy felt tears in her eyes as she looked at all the faces watching her. The house that had once been a place of fear was now a place of hope. The street that had felt dangerous was now filled with friends. Dorothy stood on the steps of the new Dorothy Brown Learning Center, the silver bell in her hand. Everyone waited quietly. Her fingers trembled slightly as she raised the bell and rang it 3 times. The clear sound echoed down the street and the crowd broke into applause. Declare the Dorothy Brown Learning Center officially open, the mayor announced, cutting the ribbon. People surged forward to enter the building. Inside, the old house had been completely transformed. The front room was now a bright library with low shelves filled with colorful books. Small tables and chairs were arranged in circles. One wall displayed photographs showing Dorothy through her teaching years. A small girl tugged at Dorothy's skirt. Are you really the lady this place is named after? She asked. Her name was Lucy, and she had the same shy look Dorothy had seen in thousands of children over the years. Yes, I am, Dorothy replied, bending down carefully to meet the child's eyes. My mom says you're brave, Lucy whispered. She says you didn't let bad people scare you away. Dorothy smiled. Sometimes being brave just means asking for help when you need it. 6 months passed quickly. The center became a busy place after school hours. Children came for reading help, art classes, and music lessons. Teenagers volunteered to earn community service credits. Retired teachers offered their time to tutor struggling students. Dorothy visited 3 afternoons each week. She had her own special corner in the library where she read stories to the youngest children. They sat around her on colorful cushions, their faces turned up to hers as she brought stories to life with her gentle voice. One rainy Tuesday, Dorothy arrived at the center to find Thomas waiting for her. He visited less often now, busy with his important cases, but he always called to check on her. I have a surprise, he said, leading her to the back garden. What had once been an empty yard was now a beautiful garden. Rose bushes lined the fence, the same varieties Dorothy grew in her own garden. In the center stood a small wooden bench with a brass plaque. Read it, Thomas urged. The plaque read, The strongest voice is not always the loudest. Dedicated to Dorothy Brown, who taught us to speak up for what is right. Dorothy's birthday fell on a warm Saturday in May. She expected a quiet day, perhaps a few cards from old friends. Instead, she opened her door that morning to find her front garden filled with people. Former students had come from all over the country. They had organized a surprise party right there on her lawn. Tables laden with food stood under trees. Children played games on the grass. Music played softly from speakers someone had set up. The mayor presented Dorothy with a special medal for service to the community. Emma and her medical colleagues announced a scholarship in Dorothy's name for students who wanted to become teachers. But the moment that touched Dorothy most deeply came near the end of the day. The blond young man who had led the gang that harassed her approached hesitantly. He looked different now. Clean-shaven, neatly dressed, his eyes clear. Mrs. Brown, he said quietly, I've come to apologize. What we did was wrong. There's no excuse. Dorothy looked at him steadily. What's your name, young man? David, he replied. What are you doing with yourself now, David? He explained that after leaving town he had hit rock bottom. Then he had found help through a community program similar to the one now housed in the center. I'm in college now, he said, training to be a youth worker. Dorothy nodded slowly. Then you've learned something important. We all make mistakes, David. What matters is what we do afterward. As evening approached, Dorothy sat on her porch watching the sunset. Her garden was quiet again, though scattered with balloon fragments and cake crumbs from the party. Thomas sat beside her, both of them comfortable in silence. "Did you ever imagine that one phone call would lead to all this?" he asked finally. Dorothy shook her head. "I just needed help with a problem. I never expected to start a movement." "That's how most movements begin," Thomas replied, "with one person who refuses to accept what's wrong and asks for help to make it right." Dorothy smiled, watching the street where she had lived for 50 years, a street that now felt more like home than ever before.